And we are live, and I think everyone should be able to hear us across all platforms, hopefully. Looks that way. Yeah. Okay. So, welcome to Coffee and a Conversation. With me today is Tom Ravlic again, and we're going to be covering a wide variety of uh, things like we normally do on our Coffee and Conversation. So, thanks for joining me today, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm okay. There are a whole bunch of people in this. Before we launch into this, there's a whole bunch of people across Australia who are in lockdown because there are various parts of the community that don't understand that viruses like the same people you do when they don't want to stay away from each other. So
What?
we've got new. Well, they obviously don't understand that viruses are kind of like fleas; they jump from person to person. What we have at the moment is people on Twitter. But before we came on, I just saw the announcement from our uh, New South Wales government that the people that are in the state above the one I'm in
Mm,
Victoria, and they announced that they've got 633 cases arising from the tests that they've done. Now
oof.
that has sent Twitter into a meltdown down here in Australia because people simply have been wanting the numbers to go down and not up, and they're trying to work out how to stop it. Well, it's quite easy to stop that. Just don't go out anywhere.
But
It's a bit. I mean,
wait
I
a minute.
understand it's difficult for people to do. I mean, you've got to appreciate that right now we need to be treating being antisocial as a virtue.
Right, right. The
Now
one and
we
only time.
yeah, well, it depends. I mean, some people are probably going to get right into it and continue it on after the pandemic. But if you sit back and let's see, we're appropriately socially distanced. You're in Detroit. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. We don't need to wear masks. Everything's fine.
Not to mention there's a computer screen between the two of us and it's virtual, but that's besides the point.
No, no, don't confuse the matter. Okay, so don't confuse the issue. Okay, keep it simple. But
Okay.
if we're yeah, so you've got people in meltdown at the moment up in Sydney, all over Twitter that are saying, "Oh dear, 633 cases." That's what happens when people are undisciplined. That's what happens when messaging doesn't work well. That's what happens when on on matters related to today's topic, being regulating opinion online. That's what happens when people are exposed to a range of sources of information, or rather disinformation, misinformation, on platforms such as the telegrams and whatever have you.
Right.
That is the outcome of an environment where people are able to tailor their own feeds. That the outcome of an environment where people are able to spend screen time looking at one perspective on the world, if they so choose, and become radicalized.
Yep.
And it's a part of the way in which we're living today, and that
Right.
is one of the reasons why I wanted to lead in with that, because uh, you have in this country and in the United States and elsewhere cohorts of people who will occupy dingy dark places on Telegram and talk about all kinds of things. Getting it, getting the vaccine.
You're getting
Turns you into some
nanobots.
sort of
Yep.
nanobots, or it makes your download speed on your modem work better if you've got. I mean, all of that nonsense.
Right.
It, there are media personalities in Australia who crack jokes about the fact that their Wi-Fi is far more superior now that they've had the vaccine, just playing up on the 5G conspiracists that occasionally
Oh no.
decide to engage in a bit of exercise on the weekends here in this country, go around waving placards and obviously unmasked.
Right.
They clearly haven't appreciated the value of the world not knowing who they are,
Exactly.
and offering themselves openly to the constabulary to arrest them at some point in time. But listen, if masking up has done anything, it's taught people the merits of, I mean, hiding themselves a little bit more from others.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. It's
that's
it's
incredible.
it's crazy. It never ceases to amaze me, I guess. And I that's probably not even the correct terminology for it. But okay, so Do I think there's completely accurate information about COVID and everything else? Do I think some things could be inflated a bit, some things not talked about enough? Absolutely. But for the ones that have jumped on the rabbit hole that say COVID is a complete conspiracy, it is a lie, it is non existent, I think is insane. And it really is, but it shows how easy it is for individuals, if you're involved in an echo chamber, to become like, if that's all you're filtering into your mind, then of course that's what you're going to believe.
I
And
mean,
it's sad. Good.
absolutely. But if I mean, people need to think about it this way. There's this whole sort of saying in sort of in health circles and sort of in dietitian circles that you are what you eat.
Yep.
And effectively, what you have is people in the online world who are simply and stupidly um, eating one kind. But what some people do with information online in terms of taking information in is the equivalent of somebody having McDonald's burgers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Mm,
I mean, you wouldn't do that to your body,
right.
let alone do that to your mind, and that is what's happening at the moment. I mean, there are
En
people in this
masse.
country who,
Yep.
there are people in this country, in Australia, who sit there and say, "I will never read a paper published by
Yep.
Rupert Murdoch, or I will never read the Guardian website, or I will never read this writer, that writer, or that writer." Well, what happens if they're the only one that's broken a story that is factual
Mm-hmm.
and that you need to understand?
Exactly.
So, are you going to deprive yourself of the value of that news item because you're part of a sort of online cabal that says something published by Rupert Murdoch is or propaganda or is regime changing material or whatever else, when in fact the journalists do some good work.
Right. Well, and
So,
that's the thing. It's like, okay, so like here in the States, we have Fox News, we have CNN, and those seem to be the two big ones that, hit each other in the head so much. But some people are like, well, I will never ever watch Fox News. Well, does Fox News get some things wrong? Yeah. Does CNN get some things wrong? Yeah. But I would like to have an informed opinion where I am gathering information from all of them. Because, like you said, just because one, you know, author or one journalist might have an outlook that may be more conservative or more liberal or whatever doesn't negate the fact that they might have the only, or they might be one of the few sources that might actually get it right sometime, even if it's a differing opinion from yours.
well, the thing is, you need to be prepared to educate yourself, and I'm sure these days what
Yes.
we're seeing is a greater polarization. So people aren't, in terms of civics, in terms of understanding how society works, what we're actually seeing in the dynamic
Mm.
online
Yep.
is that people are doing what they would do with a sporting match. They might support, using an Australian rules football analogy, um, AFL.
Mm-hmm.
uh, you've got you've got teams like Collingwood and Carlton that hate each other,
Yep.
right? So the supporters will scream and yell and carry on and basically leave a ground horse because they barracked for Collingwood against Carlton, or they've sworn at the umpire for most of the game for not giving them their players free kicks and giving the others a bit more of a hand, so to
Right.
speak. But that is how we see things develop online.
Right.
But that's a part of the so-called magic of engagement. That is what the social media people want you to do, and that is argue with each other.
Exactly.
Because if you
Yep.
argue with each other, they get engagement,
Yep.
right? They get more traffic.
Yep. Well, look at Twitter right
And
now. You were just mentioning how everybody's in an uproar. How much traffic
oh,
is Twitter getting because of all of this right now?
well, it doesn't help that there are people wandering around who are sort of failing to follow basic COVID health orders. But
Right.
yeah, but yes, the Twitter will go up in terms of activity because people genuinely get shocked
Mm-hmm.
by the fact that there's an increase in numbers. Of course, there's going to be an increase in numbers if people are not doing what they should be doing, and they may be infecting family, friends, and others.
Right.
Um, and
Well,
that's part of the ball game. And you'll have people seeking sort of incrimination of people online and everything else.
well, and you also mentioned when we were talking earlier about how we have politicians that are trying to make decisions as medical personnel instead of listening to actual medical advice from an actual doctor, we're listening to advice a lot of times from politicians
Well, we're
who don't know
asking.
it.
Well, it's worse than that.
Okay.
We're asking politicians to tell us when we will get out of lockdown.
Right. But
Now,
do they
how
know?
the hell, how the hell is a politician without any real medical knowledge other than what they've been told in a briefing in terms of an update,
Right.
going to be able to tell people when you're going to go out of lockdown or when things might be safe? Those two are
Mm,
two different propositions, by the way. You
right.
can go out of lockdown tomorrow, but that doesn't mean
It's going to
things
be
will be
safe.
safe.
Correct.
So people asking the question, people need to be careful how they frame the questions because, on the one hand, yes, you might go out of lockdown at the end of the week, but on the other hand, is it going to be safe to be wandering around in the community? Well, you'll be doing so at your own risk, won't you?
Right. It's those are hard tough questions because I know here in the states, even here in Michigan around Detroit, it's like on one hand, it's you get a lot of information and a lot of misinformation and disinformation all pushed at you at once. And a lot of people would rather be and this goes both ways. So when I say this, a lot of people would rather be sheep. But I don't say that in the sense that everybody that is an anti-vaxxer and anti-masker and everything else thinks that all the people that believe in the vaccine and everything like that are sheep, because typically when that's presented, that's what they think. But people fail to realize is that you can just follow whatever your echo chamber says without making your own informed decision. And instead, we should be trying to make our own informed decisions and not allowing our echo chambers to make those for us. Does that make sense? I knew what I was trying to say, but I might have missed the train. I don't know.
Oh, no, it's making sense. But I think the more important issue is the one I think we raised earlier, which is um, people do need to be careful
Yes,
when they
absolutely.
dive into a particular rabbit hole and begin to explore issues like, you know, um, sort of the political dynamic of vaccines as opposed to the actual medical issues. Now, yes,
Right,
uh, there will be certain people who have side effects, and it's to do with their own physical composition, etc.
right,
But you've got to, and those things are played up in the media because, you know, they're issues that when you've got a new vaccine, every time somebody gets a side effect, it becomes major news.
right,
The problem is focusing on that individual story doesn't necessarily focus on the impact of the vaccine in aggregate. Something may be rare,
right,
but that doesn't mean that it's going to crop up with every single person that has, for example, AstraZeneca or
right,
Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson and Johnson or um, Novavax or whatever that one is that's kicking around as well. But and that's the thing we've got at the moment in Australia. There's been a fair bit of vaccine
mm,
hesitancy, no doubt, fueled by people, in there are various groups on Telegram and elsewhere, um, possibly warning people that mind-altering substances and state-based control and all that sort of stuff. But I mean,
well, yeah.
they were probably reared on a very strict diet of Doctor Who and Twilight
Hey,
Zone and
well, yeah.
Lost in Space. Yeah, I mean, the Lost in Space is probably what they spent their
Majority of
childhood
the time.
watching because they're all busy running around going warning, 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 warning. I mean, it's ridiculous, and that's how their telegram feeds read. You know,
Oh,
it's like
yes.
Robbie the robot, warning, warning, Mister Robertson, warning. It's it's crazy,
It is. It is.
and they take it seriously. But I mean, as somebody said to me years ago, you can't really negotiate with stupid, can you?
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, you can try, but what does that make you for trying to negotiate with it? So,
I've had more meaningful conversations with the brick wall at the edge of my house than um. And
oh my goodness.
Acacia, your audience has lost it. She'll be back with us in a couple of seconds.
Right. I'll resume. I'll be back in a minute. You can take over while we're waiting on me to come back.
But there's some other stuff that's happening in Australia that we could probably
Yeah.
talk to our viewers about, because there's given that this is a kind of conversation aimed at formers and then people who are out of extremist movements. What's happened in Australia is really fascinating over the past few days. Last Sunday night, a program called 60 Minutes. I know you've got a US equivalent,
Uh-huh.
but there's an
Yep.
equivalent in Australia that is that's on the Nine Network,
Don't
Nine
tell
Entertainment.
anybody, but I actually prefer the Australian 60 minutes over the American one, but that's between you and me and our listeners.
Uh, okay, that's fine. I'm sure the American guys that put together the version of 60 Minutes in your country will learn something from the feedback if they in fact catch up with this
Right.
particular live stream. I hope they do.
We'll see.
They'll probably find some of it entertaining, but
Right.
probably more entertaining than their own program. But if we go back to what happened on Sunday night,
Yes.
now Nick McKenzie, a multi-award-winning journalist who worked with The Age and Sydney Morning Herald newspapers, along with some colleagues, have effectively done a sting on a white supremacist organisation in Australia called the National Socialist Network.
Yes.
Now, what happened was that they found somebody prepared to go in undercover and embed themselves
Mm-hmm.
with the group over a period of time. They managed to get footage of the group and the conversations the group had in private, the sort of training sessions, the physical training sessions, sort of boxing, weightlifting, and a range of other things. And what has transpired, and people can look up this material online. You should be able to get some of the stories that have emerged from it. Is that they've managed to, through various sources, confirm the identities of people who were members of the National Socialist Network.
Mm.
They publish their identities online and in the printed version of the newspaper. And there are stories now of individuals who are employed by various companies who are the subject of sort of company investigations
Right.
based on the revelations arising from those reports. Bearing in mind that there are the two leaders of that particular group, Tom Sewell and Jacob Hersant, are currently the subject of sort of legal proceedings. Jacob Hersant is on bail, and among the bail conditions is that he's not able to communicate on social media or on the various channels that the National Socialist Network uses, and nor associate with members of either the National
Right.
Socialist Network and its sister body or brother body, given that the members of those organisations are overwhelmingly male.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the European Australian Movement. Those two organisations are linked. The EAM is supposed to be the more polite and nice face of the white supremacist movement down here. And the National Socialist Network is this sort of activist movement with the postering,
Right.
the stickering, and graffitiing and all that sort of stuff around the place. You've got to bear in mind that those tactics are not new to the National Socialist movement. You'll know that people in the US have used them. There's a group called Action New Zealand, Zealandia over in New Zealand.
Okay.
They do the same thing. So the tactics are universally the same. All of these groups, are, as you would know, occasionally learn from each other.
Right.
They know how to upset people.
Oh yeah.
That is their objective in life, and they continue to do it. So the revelations have actually stimulated a fair bit of some amusement when people have gone to look at where these individuals have worked, what they've done, how and what they've been doing within this particular white supremacist climate that's being fostered by the National Socialist Network. And yes, we can talk about them because the major news
Right.
networks are now talking about them, right?
Right.
I mean, but they're talking about them in the context of there having been a sting and certain revelations coming out. But listen, there's nothing new in the sort of activity that they've um,
No.
looked at.
Right.
There's nothing new in the sort of the kinds of propaganda that they've spewed. I mean, you've seen the inside of a white supremacist organisation. You know what the
Right.
sort of reinforcing and messaging is like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is what the NSN's been on about. There's
Yep.
been footage. There's been footage that's been circulating of a meeting that was sort of taken um, in the footage circulating of a meeting that the NSN itself then published an actual speech delivered by Tom Sewell that they
Okay.
videotaped. So you've got this counter messaging. It's like, okay, uh, 60 Minutes has put out the footage of the actual sort
That
of
they took.
meeting
Right.
and dinner and whatever else, where the usual positioning of yeah, poor little white man getting taken over by all these others, and we sort of need to take that poor little white man getting taken over pretty seriously, all that
Right.
sort of jazz. It's quite seriously framed, okay?
Right.
Um, and the National Socialist Network publishes its version of the video and audio of that particular speech after
Right.
60 Minutes airs its footage. So there's a bit of an attempt to counter message to
Mm-hmm.
followers, I would suggest.
Propaganda. Yep.
Oh, but yeah, counter
Use
messaging,
it.
propaganda.
Use it for a as a what's the word I'm looking for? Well, since, 60 Minutes did their version, so now, NSN is going to do their version. And,
Which was obviously never a meeting that was intended to be
oh, no, probably not.
held and publicised. So
Right.
there are, um, and that's part of a news element. But there's nothing for anyone that studied the area or looked at the area closely over an extended period of time in terms of ideology, in terms of messaging. There's nothing particularly novel or new.
Right.
Um, the real novelty in all of this is the fact that they've managed to infiltrate
Infiltrate.
and uh, identify people. Now, there are, uh, I would suggest that is interesting,
Right.
but there are also consequences. There are also other consequences in
Consequences.
terms of people's employment and everything else that will flow from this in terms of the public presence, because the general community, once individuals are known as members of certain types of
Yep.
organisations, will call on the employers to take some kind of action.
Correct. Now, from, let's see, in many aspects, I think if their ideology, if what they're doing is carried over into their professional or work life, depending on what their job position is and whatnot. I think some action sometimes may need to be taken. However, I think people should be very cautious when doing something like this, only because it can further radicalize an individual. And I don't think the media realizes what that can do. Because if an individual is involved with something like this and maybe they are only on the fence and not fully radicalized, if you take away their way of caring for their family, if they have a family, their only means of employment. And if they are if they are doxxed or outed that they're a part of something, and you completely take away their ability to support their family, you might very well be creating an extremist or further radicalizing somebody, because the worst thing, there is no more dangerous of a person than that person that has nothing left to lose. So while I think that action should be taken, I think employers and the media need to think about it very carefully and to investigate and to look at all the pieces involved with it, if that makes sense.
Well, I think there were a couple of issues you mentioned. One is the immediate prospects of somebody losing employment as a result of the media revelations, and then there is their capacity to uh, actually uh, gain some sort of employment somewhere else. But there's two things that need to be kept in mind. So somebody may be doxed, to use the modern term for it.
Right.
Um, Being a dinosaur, I'm just getting used to that stuff. But if you're looking at that from that point of view, you're right, because what you're actually doing is um, by virtue of the process of revealing um, the by virtue of the process of revealing this, and I'm just looking at the question that's been put forward by EJ, being taking proper actions.
Right.
And I'm not sure what proper action necessarily looks like
That's
in
the
this
hard part.
circumstance.
Right.
Um, so how does somebody then gain employment if they've been subjected to a media sort of a sting of an organisation they've been a part of, or a group of people they've been a part of, let alone dealing with the employment issues that arise from uh, being sort of revealed as a member of a supremacist slash extremist group.
Right.
I mean that is a challenging question, and what we also need to remember is that these guys then end up, um, if they end up unemployable,
Right.
they then end up on social welfare, right?
Yep.
It's not like it's not like the society ceases to have an obligation for these people.
Right.
Um, uh, so that's the other interesting element, which is, what do you do when these guys are unemployable? They then get on welfare.
It also adds to their grievance. Now, am I saying that proper action, whatever that might actually be, should not be taken? Absolutely not. I am not saying that whatsoever. But what I am saying is that before somebody jumps to a conclusion of what that action should be, before having a knee jerk reaction, it needs to be thought about and pondered and figured out, because I know of individuals, not personally, but just situations here, like in the US, of certain people being doxxed or outed. And if anything, it drove them further in and further committed, but it also gave um, validity to some of the grievances that they already had. Whereas otherwise, there would not have been validity to it. Because one of the things that a lot of these organizations say is that they're trying to take our livelihoods. They're trying to take these things from us. And then in return, if those things are taken away, they just turn around and say, "See, I told you. This is what
It's
would
a,
happen."
it's effectively self-sealing, which is another problem. The
Yeah.
other thing that's interesting, Acacia, is to contemplate what people like Sophia Moskalenko and Clark Macaulay have done in their studies of radicalization. And I spoke to on my podcast called Critical Line Item. You'll find an interview with Sophia Moskalenko if you're interested. She's a US based. clinical and social psychologist who has done extensive research on radicalisation.
Mm.
And the research that she's done, along with Clark Macaulay, it provides people with good bottom. Now, there was a paper published in Perspectives on Terrorism a few months back that looked at the issue of radical opinion and radical action in the context of QAnon.
Okay. Yep.
But the twin pyramid model that they've got can be used for any form of radicalisation or any rather ideology that people are captured by or radicalised by, because you've got two things that people need to think about.
Mm-hmm.
One of which is um, one of which is quite clearly that if you're policing someone's radical opinion, there's every chance that you could, you know, turn them further
Mm-hmm.
towards being more making that position solidified.
Right.
Particularly if the policing is being done in various ways. I think that social media mobs do it quite a bit in terms of uh, politics and other issues online. So radical opinion is very different, according to Moskalenko and Macaulay, to radical action.
Right. And I
People
would
can
agree.
hold people can hold opinions, but that doesn't mean they're going to go out and act on them.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, and Sophia Moskalenko did mention the fact that there might be any number of millions of people that have some sort of perspective on QAnon, but there's only a handful, around about 60 to 70 QAnon adherents who've actually committed criminal offences
Right.
in line with that belief.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is a kind of a revealing statistic, because if people are jumping up and down and saying, well, QAnon is crazy, therefore these people are crazy, you might be pushing them further towards embracing the sort
Exactly.
of the smorgasbord of things that are identified as QAnon ideologies or QAnon narratives,
Right.
as opposed to focusing on people that are not only adherents to those ideologies, but have a typology, a psychological kind of profile
Yep.
that results in them acting. Now this comes down to how you read the play online as well, and how you read the play on encrypted apps. Who are the leaders? Who are people that have the capacity
Right.
to do certain things, as opposed to people that are drifters who plug into this stuff,
Right.
and have no intention to cause harm, but believe there might be a validity to something because um, they've seen media coverage of political corruption.
Right.
Therefore, they assume elites behave a particular way. Therefore, they assume that there's a cabal behind the scenes that's doing all sorts of weird stuff with kids in tunnels and goodness knows
Right.
what else.
Exactly.
So there's a natural progression. There's a reasonable suspicion of corrupt conduct, which you know every country has some degree of
Right.
political graft or persuasion that you can define as sort of perhaps soft corruption, if
Right.
you, for want of a better term. But how far you go with that in terms of the sort of concepts of you know cabals and networks and all sorts of crazy. Uh,
Right.
it really depends on an individual who's trying to uh, potentially embrace something or try and find an explanation to what's going on around them, whether it be COVID, whether it be did Jeff Epstein kill himself, whether it be whatever.
There could be so
And
many. So many.
it, and there could be all sorts of things that people are trying to find answers to.
Right.
Um, and there'd be some sort of false swamis and some sort of in a Telegram group throwing up everything from you know aliens in Area 51 to Jew to global Jewish conspiracies, whatever else.
Right.
All of that is enmeshed in a salad bowl
Yep.
for some of these characters, um, because they're either out of work or they don't believe, or they've lost trust in institutions telling them about medical cures, or when we're going to end with COVID and whatever have you.
Right.
And it, and that's part of the problem. And whether regulating certain platforms deals with it, I'm not sure,
Right.
because the regulation of particular platforms means yeah, you do get to a point where you're going to be pushing people elsewhere.
Right. Now, EJ was saying firing someone for religious or political reasons is against the law in some ways, which here in America it is. I don't know about in Australia. But and he was saying that it could trigger violence. Like, and he was just saying, for instance, what was said before, investigate the situation before taking action. Don't take a knee-jerk reaction is what he was talking about when he was saying take proper action. And I agree. And exactly what you were saying. I mean, you take a knee-jerk reaction, and we as humans are so susceptible to this, to
We're
reacting.
reactive.
Yes.
We're reactive. Look at the big, and we are now dealing with um, a world that is in shock because of the way in which a coalition of countries dealt with 9/11.
Yes. Yep.
Right? We are living in a world that cannot understand how the Taliban came back, right? And came back so quickly.
Right.
So quickly that Western countries are now trying to pull out their own citizens, as well as where practicable and where they're able,
Right.
pull out people who were individuals that helped
Mm-hmm.
uh, Australians, or Americans or the British fulfill their operational missions over in Afghanistan.
Right.
And we're seeing that move absolutely rapidly at the moment. And again, if you want to look at my podcast with Molly Saltzcog, I recorded one earlier today. Well, I'm obviously a guest on this particular live stream, but I do have one that I do control.
And
Um,
definitely check it out. If you guys get a
I,
chance to check it out.
I don't, yeah, I don't know where these discussions go because Acacia's at the wheel. But if you,
Wherever we want to go.
it could end up anywhere by the time we finish the hour. Trust me. But um, I spoke with Molly Saltzcog over in your part of the world, who's one of the analysts, senior intelligence analysts with the Sufan Centre,
Mm,
and we spoke about this very phenomenon. There are many errors made by the coalition, particularly the United States,
mm-hmm.
that can be used to fire up people who are Islamists, who are now former prisoners and ISIS adherents, Al Qaeda adherents, who are now out and about, who've
Mm,
got a real grievance against the West.
mm-hmm.
Remember, and we need to remember the history. I mean, there are some people who are probably not even alive at the time what I'm about to say happened. But
Right.
you've got to remember the history. The Russians left Afghanistan. Bin Laden and his cohort that formed Al Qaeda basically said, "Look, we'll deal with the United States, which had abandoned us
Right.
after the Russians left. So we've defeated the Russians, and we'll deal with the US." And gradually, over a period of time, you had this accumulation of grievance against the West.
Mm,
You had an accumulation of grievance against the West in what went on in the Balkans in the early 1990s, when people people who were essentially what we would today call jihadists, so people who wanted to go and fight in Bosnia to help the Muslims in Bosnia fight the other side.
mm,
And that carried its way through the 90s. You came to 1997 when CNN managed to score a coup with Peter Bergen, who was one of the producers and researchers at the time in the sort of Middle Eastern region, with Peter Arnett doing an interview with Osama bin Laden, basically saying, "Yeah, we got a problem with people in the West."
Mm,
and we can't guarantee the safety of U.S. citizens anywhere if they're somewhere near the military or whatever have you. In
gotcha.
1998, in 1998, February '98, you had um, the the publication of the Declaration of War against America by
Right.
Osama bin Laden and his cohort. So you've now got people who've helped the West in Afghanistan who are, who would be viewed as Western allies,
Right.
who would be viewed as traitors, whose lives are in threat, and we've got people who helped the Australian government and the Australian military hunker down in Kabul and not leaving the houses they're um, in the hope that there will be a flight that will take them out of
Right.
Afghanistan, either to a third location or to Australia itself, in order to live a life in freedom, given that they've served a foreign power, and that is not something that's actually um, approved of or seen as being um, you know, okay by the Taliban.
Right.
Now we've seen the public relations offensive by the Taliban over the past few days, saying it's okay. We've got an amnesty. We've got an amnesty, and all these people that have helped Western governments or the previous government of Afghanistan. Now, how are these people supposed to take the Taliban seriously when they've been receiving night letters, basically saying, "We know you have been working with the infidel, and we're coming for you."
Right.
On the one hand, there's a PR offensive to the West to say, well, we're going to try and calm the farm.
Doesn't work though.
From a contact of mine last night, late at night, when I was writing a comment piece for a publication called The Mandarin, which I hope will get published later today, if not today, tomorrow,
Nice.
where I was providing some degree of analysis in the situation related to former staff of the embassy, former security guards employed by contracting companies like Gardaworld, um, who are now fearing for their life. I received a text from somebody last night saying, you know, we are basically waiting to die.
Yeah.
This is the demoralized state that some people who've worked for Western governments are in right now.
Yep.
And that is what we need to be, that's what we need to understand. Then, along with that text, I received a photograph purported that was described as having been a photograph taken at the outskirts of Kabul at a place called Mazar. There was a thumping great ditch. And a contact of mine said that photograph of that particular ditch with bodies in it was actually a photograph of people who had been military interpreters. That's so you've got on the one hand you've got the Taliban telling the world everything will be okay.
Oh
On
yeah.
the other hand, you have got gradual intelligence coming out saying it's not okay, and the threats made in night letters are probably being carried out as the West is as the Taliban is trying to hose down the sort of things you and I are talking about now, and that is
Exactly.
now, that is their attempt to manage the situation to get people to avert their eyes from Afghanistan while things are happening on the ground.
Right. Well,
Only
and
yes, only yesterday, I was seeing a flow of messages in a WhatsApp group uh, where journalists were telling us that people on the ground, that is Taliban on the ground, are going door to door looking for media. Why would they be doing that? They'd be doing that because they want to extinguish any hope of the real reality of a return of a Taliban regime in Afghanistan getting out.
of course. Well, there was it was a CNN reporter, and there's memes going around about it all over Twitter and everything else, but She's like, yes, they are chanting death to America, but they seem so friendly.
Um,
What?
yeah, that's. I mean, yeah, I saw an appalling tweet,
Uh,
from the Republican Ted Cruz,
oh no.
who quite happily nicked off to Cancun while his state was in some sort of frozen stupor,
Right.
um, having a crack at CNN and the CNN journalist in Kabul, telling the world what was going on in one of the most momentous historical occasions. I mean, in all seriousness, I'm not sure what planet Ted Cruz comes from, but he really needs to come down to earth. I mean, that tweet was appalling, and CNN International's response to him was entirely appropriate.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I'll have to look it up and take a look maybe. It might
I
just
mean,
make me mad.
for an elected representative to troll, people like a CNN reporter in the midst of what will turn out to be a major
Oh
humanitarian
yeah,
crisis, if it isn't already,
already
is
is.
absolutely ridiculous. It
Well,
is I mean, I don't know which cornflakes box some of your elected officials come from, but geez, that brand is terrible.
I'll tell you what. I mean, I'm not gonna get real political here, but I have seen Twitter has got to be the worst possible thing for elected officials nowadays because it's just like some of the things that I see people tweeting that are supposed to be in the professional world is horrendous because it's like, dude, when I was growing up, you didn't say things like this. You kept a professional demeanor. You did not take personal swipes. You did not take, you didn't do it. And nowadays, it's everywhere. Twitter is one of the worst, but you see elected officials on all the sides taking personal swipes, and instead of trying to bring people together, it's like, how far can we dig to cause division and to keep that division? And
They,
that's
they,
just
they,
my two
they,
cents, two
they're
cents on
not
it.
interested. Look, quite frankly, there are many in politics and many in journalism who are not interested in solutions. They're interested in polarization, and they're interested in building a tribe.
True.
That is all they understand.
Yeah,
That
I
is all
I
they
agree.
understand. I mean, we're seeing it here in Australia as well. We're no different. I mean, we've got our own class of idiots, and that just continues on. But I think that the point you made earlier about professionalism and the media and sort of doing a job without getting personal was sort of made uh, quite quite poignantly the other night on a Media Watch program on our public broadcaster, the ABC, where they covered a recent instance of an ABC journalist who was sued by a politician because other journalists apologised for tweets they put up that were deemed to be inaccurate
Right.
following a police investigation. It was something that this particular journalist didn't do, or didn't apologise,
Right.
and the politician took legal action against her. The
Hmm.
public broadcaster has had agreed to pay the costs of that particular legal action, which was $79,000 in damages plus the court costs plus some additional expenses of the particular politician concerned.
Right.
Now, that says something. First and foremost, journalists need to not go off to script,
Right.
if I can put it that way,
Hmm.
and keep themselves in a degree of aloofness from the stories they put together.
Right.
It become you know, there are several things that are wrong with the Twitter world where journalists are concerned. First is if you are doing a story objectively, don't give people a reason to look at your Twitter feed and say you are biased for this side or that side or that side or
Exactly.
whatever else. Um, you need to preserve your own objectivity and your own independence. Uh, and in the audience's mind, no matter how often you say, use my own, I mean, that's just a fig leaf.
Yep.
An audience will pick up your Twitter feed and look at what you do professionally, and they will transpose your views as enunciated on Twitter onto what you've done professionally in a newspaper, online, or on television or on radio, and they'll turn around and say, you've done that because you hold this particular base level belief on this particular issue.
Exactly.
Now, journalists are going to howl and say, well, that doesn't matter. People shouldn't be doing that. No, people are looking at all the available information. They're triangulating things for themselves. They're not stupid.
Right.
And if you're someone who's a progressive uh, in your political views, and you are spending a lot of time chasing conservative politicians up and down a drain pipe, people are going to sit there and they're going to look at it and say, well, this is consistent with your progressive views.
Right.
Are you truly doing an objective exercise in journalism here, or are you looking for regime change?
Right.
And that is the thing that the profession I'm a part of, again, the media, needs to be wary of.
Right.
How often is something an objective telling of a story, or is something a telling of a story to affect regime change further down the road? And that is something that we need to keep in mind when we're analysing the media, quite frankly, even those of us like me who are practitioners and the audience.
Now, here's a question for you.
Oh, you've got one.
Oh, I do. I do. It's
Oh,
amazing.
fantastic.
Um, being part of, your part of the media, as far as, you're a journalist yourself and everything. How
Yep.
how much do you think, um or how difficult is it as a journalist to do objective reporting, the job of a journalist, without allowing your own personal to get in the way of
I'll,
the
I'll,
professional?
I'll tell you what my perspective is quite bluntly. As a general rule, if we talk about political coverage,
Hmm.
as a general rule, uh, I tell this to people, and I've focused on this myself over my career, and that is I don't care what ideological spectrum a politician sits on.
Hmm.
They must be held accountable equally because of the fact that they're receiving public funds for doing the job as a politician.
Exactly.
Now, there are people who say in the media who say they hate this politician, they hate that politician, they hate the prime minister, or they like what the opposition leader is doing. That's a matter of opinion. But
Yes.
ultimately, when you're dealing with reportage, if you allow your opinion to skew how you report on the politics of the day,
Hmm.
without a factual basis, and I'll take the viewers in the some of the things I've done on the Afghanistan issue um, in a moment. But if you are uh, incapable of looking at an issue and saying, okay, how do we, how does this issue play out,
Right.
rather than how does this issue contribute to regime change? Um, that's the thing that most concerns me. I don't particularly care what the ideology is. I don't care whether they're progressive or conservative.
Hmm.
Um, I couldn't give two hoots. I don't give a stuff. I'd much rather kick them equally. It's
Right.
much more fun that way. Don't sort of just. The more shins you have to kick, the better. Don't exempt any. Don't exempt the part of the population from being kicked by you. For heaven's sake, you deprive yourself of fun. But also, it's the way you need to think. For example, there was a recent story involving um, a QAnon believer who. Let me take the viewers through this because they will find this fascinating. We might have done this last time, but that's okay.
That's okay. We can go over again.
That's it. We can go over it again, but it'll crack people up because there's been a story that's been circulating for some time over the fact that our Prime Minister is married to a woman who has a long term friend who is a QAnon adherent. Okay. Does everybody follow? Let me repeat that. Our Prime Minister is married to his wife, Jenny, who has a friend by the name of Lynn, who is married to a guy called Tim, who is a QAnon adherent.
Gotcha.
Now, okay, you've got that. Then we have a whole narrative about the fact that uh, apparently the Prime Minister added a word or changed a word in his speech to talk about ritual abuse or ritual sexual abuse, which is a trigger of which sort of triggered people to look at the QAnon stuff when there was private messages released between two individuals. Uh, that would sort of from Signal
Right.
that indicated that Tim, who is married to Lynn, who is a friend of the Prime Minister's wife, Jenny, might have persuaded the Prime Minister to insert the word ritual. Now, this is complicated, isn't it?
It takes way too much thought because it's like, okay, because X has a relationship with Y, and Y has a relationship with Z, and Z has a relationship with A. Therefore, somehow A's beliefs and opinions affected Z or X. Yeah.
And you sit back and you analyze it, and people sort of go, woo.
Right.
And now I go back to my point earlier with the work of Moskalenko and Macaulay, looking at radical opinion and radical action. Radical opinion is one thing, and even if somebody persuaded the Prime Minister to include a word in the speech, it is nowhere near as significant a threat to national security or to the national well-being as political donations from mining companies or other
Exactly.
major corporations. So you've got to look at these issues and this reportage in perspective,
Right.
right?
Perspective
Um,
is a lot.
oh yeah, and then you've got the QAnon is big in the United States. No, this is how it worked. The FBI, the FBI classes QAnon as a domestic threat. The Prime Minister knows someone who's a QAnon adherent. Therefore, the QAnon adherent in Australia is a domestic threat and must be dealt with. Right?
Right.
See, the journos and others have drawn material from the US and deliberately dropped that into the Australian climate. And I'm thinking, hold on,
Right.
how dumb are we? To do that, to analyze this properly, you need to actually say, okay, um, you know, an objective test. What are our gun laws like in Australia versus the US? A damn sight better, much stricter. And
Right.
then you sit back and you say, okay, so when was the last time people saw um, groups of individuals with helmets on, um, dressed to the nines with bulletproof vests and stupid Hawaiian shirts and AR-15s romping around the streets of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Darwin, or Perth, or Hobart, Launceston, or Alice Springs?
Has
No,
that
that
ever
doesn't
happened?
happen here.
Yeah, I didn't think so. I thought that was
No,
more of a
well,
US thing.
I mean, we reserve that sort of clown car for the United States, right?
Yes.
So you've got a basic point of analysis that tells you any security assessment of Australia needs to be done in the context of Australia. Yes, there are
Exactly.
sort of 70 odd people who've been convicted of or of offences that relate to taking action as a result of being sort of QAnon kooks, for want of a better term. But you can't extrapolate that to the Australian climate necessarily because of the fact that Australia has a a need for a unique assessment based on its own environment.
Exactly.
Quite frankly, I just sat there and I went, scratched my head, and I thought, well, how do we get to this point?
Going down
How
rabbit
do we get to
holes
this
and
point?
then more and then more.
Absolutely, but that's the kind of thing that we need to grapple with as an institute, as a media institution, but also society needs to grapple with.
Right.
It's easy to scare people.
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to scare
Oh,
people.
yeah.
uh, the Taliban and no doubt Al Qaeda are doing it now in Afghanistan.
Yep.
People on various extremes in the West scare scare people all the time. Just look
Yep.
at what happens when you look at what happens when far right uh, individuals that are white supremacists talk about Islam.
Yep.
Not only are they sort of scaring people to sort of in a position to sort of try and hate an imaginary other. What they're also doing is they're giving people on the Islamist side, the jihadist side, an excuse to hate people in the West.
Yep.
This is a perpetual feeding cycle. It's a feeding frenzy. And the adherents on either extreme have probably forgotten that they're feeding each other.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think that they even view it as that. I mean, I know when, you look at a lot of these things, they're like, well, yeah, they feed off of each other's extremism,
Absolutely, it's a vicious circle,
plain and
Acacia,
simple.
and that's something we need to sort of to focus on as communities. And this kind of thing is fostered online. It's fostered in encrypted
Yep.
apps. They're good. I'm not going to complain about the fact that that provides a good educational resource for academics and psychologists looking at understanding radicalisation. But
Right.
it ain't helping the community out there, because what we're seeing at a time when the coronavirus has caused people to lose work or to get on welfare. People are concerned about the future of their kids, etc. They're looking for alternative explanations.
Yep.
And what they haven't realised is there's probably no alternative explanation other than sit down on your rear and wait for some things to pass.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's well, and then, you also yeah, it's a revolving door. I mean, you absolutely said it right. And one thing feeds another without even realizing it a lot of times. And then you have, here, at least here in the US, and I know probably there too, we're talking about, regulating opinion online, Here it's like free speech, but where does that stop and where does, it start and everything else? And somebody actually had a article and it was krg.org. It's a public, like a PBS site, but it was called The Thorny Questions Raised by Trying to Regulate Speech on Social Media. And it talked about how when Trump was president, that Facebook blocked him and wouldn't let him speak on there or Twitter and other places. And the author was Peter Goodman, and he had said that, you know, he liked the fact that he didn't have to hear Trump anymore. He didn't have to hear his opinions anymore and look at it and all of that. But he also said, and I'm quoting this, says, abridging free speech, except in extremely narrow confines, is also a danger to our democracy. So it's like, how far is too far and how far is not far enough?
But yeah,
That's scary.
the other thing is, how do you teach people what BS is
Exactly.
if there's no thing to analyze and to observe, because
Yes.
you can't sanitize ugliness in the world.
No,
Okay,
you can't.
you
Yep.
can't sanitize. I mean, you can't sanitize the fact that stuff is happening in Afghanistan. I saw a very
Yep.
good journalist online yesterday, an ethical journalist, um, apologize for potentially you know, putting up things that are slightly graphic in description on Twitter that are happening in Afghanistan. My response was, just keep pushing it out, simply because people need to understand what's going on. People need to understand the world is ugly.
Yep.
How the hell do you know what's going on in the world if you fail to expose yourself to that? I
Yep.
mean, the most ridiculous thing I observe on Twitter and other social media is that people spend more time getting outraged on what happens on The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, the
Yep.
Survivor series. Um, some program we've got here called Married at First Sight, which occasionally members of my family watch, which is absolute rubbish. Um, they get
It
worked
sounds like
up more.
rubbish.
It is rubbish. It's scripted garbage. and people fall for it and they argue with each other over it on Twitter. Now we've got more important things to do in this world than argue about reality television shows.
We do.
And I've got no problem people talking about stuff that's going on in Afghanistan because,
Right.
quite frankly, we need to know that more than we need to know about, the latest uh, piece of clothing some Kardashian has worn. I couldn't care less.
Exactly. I could not agree with you more on that. Like,
I mean, what the Kardashians going to solve world peace? So they go in and extricate people from Kabul? No, they're not.
you wouldn't find them even anywhere near that. If they're not in their mansion or on some TV show, you're not going to find them anywhere. The world is not Hollywood, people.
No, it's not Hollywood. It's not even a sanitized Twitter timeline.
Exactly.
Um, and that's part of the problem. Real life is ugly, and if you don't, if people want to curate their life online to eliminate that kind of news, then they've got problems.
Well, and the thing is, too, is that we forget that, just because person A doesn't want to see it, just because person A would rather focus on The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, if that's what they want to focus on, then let them focus on that. That doesn't mean the rest of the world can't view and be informed on what the reality of things
Oh
are.
yeah, but you've got a generation that is, and it unfortunately seems to them to spend more time on guff uh, than the grit of the kind of thing that we've been talking about over the past hour.
Right. It's, I'll tell you what, we could go on and on and on and on.
Oh,
We,
we could
we
go
could go
on,
on for
but
days.
we could go on. No, we're not going to do a blinking marathon. I'm going to go and have lunch.
Right? You got to go and have lunch, and I've got to go to bed sometime.
Oh, well, that's a good idea.
you know, as long as, no insomnia tonight, I'm good on that. But you have definitely given us more things to think about until the next time that you're on. And everybody that's listening, please go check out Tom's, excuse me, Tom's podcast, I can't even talk, Critical Line Item. And I'll put it
Yeah,
up in the description
as
for
I
you.
said, as I said to you earlier, there's a couple that are worthwhile listening to. Back the other day, I interviewed a journalist, Karen Middleton, who was embedded with the Australian troops in Afghanistan. We spoke
Oh,
about
wow.
her experience over there and what she's hearing from Kabul. So that was recorded a couple of days ago. And this morning, uh, due to the wonderful benefits of technology, I interviewed Molly Saltskog, which it's about 20-25 minutes
Okay.
um,
Check it
on
out.
the actual title of the thing is "You Can't Bomb Your Way out of a narrative."
Oh, wow. I like that.
Oh, I like my headlines too. I just
I
want
do
people to
too.
listen.
Can't bomb your way out of a narrative.
You can't bomb your way out of a narrative. So that's what Molly Saltcock from the Superbarn Centre. I'm grateful for Molly for making time because right now, when you're talking international security, the guys at the Superbarn Centre are busy dealing with their clients and
Right.
busy analysing the situation on a minute by minute basis. So she wedged me in between emergency meetings, and I'm grateful for that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us, and you've given us a lot to think about as usual. And as always, it's been great conversation, and look forward to the next time we have you on, Tom. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, and look forward to joining you and the audience again.